Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you very much.
May I call Sir Vince Cable, please?
Yeah.
I'd like to take that in again and then repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Let's take a seat.
Thank you.
Good morning, Sir Vince. My name is Jason Beer, and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Can you give us your full name, please?
John Vincent Cable.
Thank you. For those listening and watching, if I'm speaking in more than usually loud voice today, and if I'm getting closer to the microphones than is usual, there is a good reason for that, which Sir Vince understands.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Can you look at a witness statement that you've kindly prepared for the inquiry, please? It's in front of you.
Yeah.
It should be 53 pages long and dated the 27th of June 2024. And if you look at the last page, page 53, do you see your signature?
Yes, I do.
Are the contents of that witness statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they're true to the best of my knowledge and belief.
Thank you very much. You can put that to one side now. All of the other documents I'll show you will come up on the screen. I think by training and background, you are an economist, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And after university and the like, you entered the civil service, is that correct?
For a couple of years, yes, and then I was later a special advisor within the Department of Trade and Industry, but mostly not in the civil service, but I had a stretch there.
And then you worked in business before being elected to Parliament in 1997, is that right?
Correct, yes.
And so far as concerns this inquiry, the most important office you held was as Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills, and was that between the 12th of May 2010 and the 12th of May 2015?
Yes, that was the full length of the coalition government.
So 5 years.
5 years, yes.
At all times in that period, is it right that there was a junior minister responsible for postal affairs?
Yes, I think there were 6 or 7 junior ministers, and one was responsible for postal affairs, amongst other things. Most notably, I think, labour relations, consumer protection.
You list them in paragraph 21 of your statement, no need for it to be turned up. But there were a succession of junior ministers with responsibility for postal affairs in that 5-year period, is that right?
Yes, there were 4.
Was that a regular or normal number of junior ministers holding down a post over at that kind of period?
Well, I think there was quite a high turnover generally. The 4 ministers you referred to were people from my party. The other junior ministers were Conservatives. But they had a turnover which was really directed by the Prime Minister. My group of ministers were essentially appointed by Nick Clegg and worked with me.
Did you get any sense that there was churn, as it's sometimes referred to, in that ministerial post that may have made it difficult for the person occupying it to grasp, fully understand, get to grips with post office issues?
I wouldn't say abnormally so. I mean, I was unusual in having 5 years in my office. I think under the governments that just passed, we had cabinet ministers who held jobs for a few months, but I was unusual. I think in Joe Swinson's case, there was an interruption because of a maternity leave. That was, I think, very understandable. That wasn't really churn, but the others changed because of an overall mix in our ministerial portfolio. Ed Davey became a Secretary of State, for example.
Did you get any sense in your period of office that the brief held by the person responsible for postal affairs, the minister responsible for postal affairs, was too broad, i.e. there was too much to do?
Well, there was a vast amount within the department. I think we may come to this in more detail later, but in the briefing pack, the topical briefing pack, I noticed there was a list of 100 items which came within my portfolio, roughly, and Post Office was one of them. And the portfolio had to be divided up between ministers and civil servants. The Post Office was part of a junior minister's portfolio, and I think that was proportionate given the wide range of things that we had to do.
Did any of the junior ministers in your time ever raise with you a problem as to capacity such that they couldn't give postal affairs sufficient attention?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in my judgment, they were highly conscientious and very intelligent ministers and very capable and perfectly capable of handling the responsibility. I met them regularly as party colleagues and ministers. We talked formally and informally, and they kept me abreast of issues which they found particularly important.
In paragraph 2 of your witness statement, again, no need to turn it up, you say, quote, "I'm informed that a large number of documents which should have been retained cannot be located, such as my official diary and minutes of meetings." Sir Ed Davey and Joe Swinson have said similar things to the inquiry. Do you know why such papers, including your official diary, which is presumably an important record of your activities, was not retained?
I have no idea why they weren't retained, but there were, in my case, there were some what I would call seminal meetings which were never recorded. I had a first courtesy call meeting with Paula Venables and Alice Perkins, for example. There doesn't seem to be any record of that, though I registered with them some of my concerns about the Post Office at that point. There was a meeting where a Member of Parliament, Mr. Bridgen, brought the Federation to tell me about some of the distressing cases of sub-postmasters. There appears to be no record of that either.
Have you asked why there is no record?
Yes, I was told that people had searched and couldn't find it. I think probably it has to do with the transition which was taking place from paper to digital. When I first started the job, almost everything was done on paper. Letters came into the department. I think by the end of it, it was email-based, and for a variety of reasons, complete records were not kept.
You tell us also in paragraph 2 of your witness statement that in your 5 years in office, problems with Horizon barely came across your desk. Is that right?
That is correct, and when they did, it was usually in a very uncontroversial way, and it was not drawn to my attention as an issue I should focus on.
That 5-year period was a significant one in relation to the unfolding events concerning Horizon, including within that 5-year period, because campaigning work was being undertaken by the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. There was the threat of a class action being brought against the Post Office in the courts. There had been the discovery of evidence in that 5-year period which cast doubt on the safety of criminal convictions obtained by the Post Office when acting as a private prosecutor. The CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, had commenced an investigation into the safety of some convictions. At Second Sight, the forensic accountants had been instructed and had produced 4 reports in that 5-year period. It marked the beginning, middle and end of the initial complaint and mediation scheme run by the Post Office. Deloitte, forensic accountants, had completed reports on the Horizon system. I've given you a smattering of things that happened in that 5-year period where you say Horizon barely came across your desk. Looking at it in the round, how do you think it is that Horizon barely came across your desk in that 5-year period?
Well, I think the general reason is that the officials who were briefing me and the ministers on the subject hadn't seen it as a particular problem. I think with hindsight, I should have been told at the outset about Horizon, what it was. It was just a word. I should have been told that people were querying its, good, competent people, Computer Weekly, for example. I knew nothing of their work. We should have been told that people were suggesting there was a risk factor. And I should have been told about Mr. Bates and the Justice Group. I never heard his name until I'd been in the job 5 years at the end when the whole issue came to a head. But certainly I wasn't briefed on them, and I think probably this came down to civil servants making a judgment that because I had a vast area of responsibility and because it was being well handled at a minister level, that I didn't need to be told about them.
Thank you. You tell us in paragraph 4 of your witness statement that governments across the political spectrum share some responsibility for the fact that the scandal happened on their watches, and that you accept your share of responsibility.
Yes, to be frank, I found it very difficult to pinpoint particular events or decisions that I could have done differently, but simply as a matter of formal responsibility, this was a state enterprise that came within the remit of my department, and I accept the fact that it happened on our watch. I know that's a cliche, but it's something that ministers have to recognise.
I was about to ask you, when you say that you accept your share of responsibility, what are you accepting responsibility for?
Well, general oversight of the department, and this was an area of the department where clearly there was a policy failure. But as far as I recall, there weren't any specific interventions that I made or was asked to make that would have changed any of those long list of things that you described.
Can we get down to some specifics then and start with the issue of your knowledge of key issues relating to sub-postmaster challenges concerning Horizon? And if we just turn up paragraph 33 of your witness statement, it'll come up on the screen, please. It's on page 12.
Yeah.
Page 33. You're here dealing with, as part of your chronological account, the period of time when you took up office. Right. And you say in 33, I was not briefed by officials on or otherwise aware of any issues to do with the Post Office's IT system at this time. You had you previously, if we go back to paragraph 13 of your witness statement, which is on page 5. Thank you. This is years before you took up office.
Yes.
And in this part of your witness statement, you're telling us more generally about your knowledge of the Post Office.
Yes.
You say, I became aware of allegations of fraud when a constituent was charged and lost his post office. You cannot recall exactly when this was. It was probably 2001 to 2. You approached the family and offered help. They told me that the charges were unjustified, but they wanted to rely on justice and not involve me as an MP. The family never mentioned IT. And then, thirdly, in paragraph 92 of your witness statement, which is on page 37, you say, before I came into government, I think I had 8 closures in my constituency. I organised and collected numerous petitions against branched closures. Usually postmasters did not want to become involved because they were afraid of the consequences. And then this, when we came into government, Ed Davey and I agreed, based on our experience as constituency MPs that post office middle management were, as I described, and you refer to a debate in Parliament in 1999, authoritarian. Mr. Bates, as I believe, described them as thugs in suits, and I recognise this description. Post Office dealt with us in an arrogant way when we campaigned against closures. So drawing the threads together there, you had been involved in a separate issue, a closure issue, and that had given you some insight into the way that Pole middle management behaved. Is that right?
That's correct. So just to elaborate a little bit, I had raised a debate in Parliament, I think probably I was one of the first, about the way in which postmasters were treated by the Post Office. And there was a particular case, which you haven't referred to, but there's a particular case of a woman in my constituency who's had invested, I think, £7,500,000 in her post office. It was taken away from her for reasons that were never clearly explained. She lost all the money. Another post office opened up nearby for reasons that were never explained. And I never got good answers as to why this was happening. So I called a debate, and it basically chimed in with other experiences I had of the post office. For example, I'd been campaigning for months on post office closures in my own constituency and others, and I took them to the post office, and it was all sort of brushed aside. I was an interfering politician, it was nothing to do with me. Operational matters were matters for the post office and not for ministers or politicians. So I'd formed a very negative impression in the case, and it was reinforced in government. Because I think I mentioned a few minutes ago that I think the one occasion when I was a minister where these distressing cases were brought to me was by a deputation, not a deputation, a single man, a member from the Federation, about, I think, 50 to 100 cases. He brought a scrapbook of photographs to illustrate it. So I knew that these expulsions, fraud cases and so on were taking place, but throughout the whole of that, in none of these cases did anybody, as far as I remember, ever say anything about the computers. It was seen as I saw it, I had a theory which may have been proved to be wrong, but essentially the post office had what I would call a one strike and you're out policy, that if a postmaster made a mistake, they would be punished severely, but not necessarily anything to do with computing mistakes. That emerged subsequently. And just if I can just add one final point, that when I was campaigning on behalf of postmasters at that stage, and it was 10 years before I went into government, I did get a lot of help from the Federation. There was Mr. Baker, who was in charge at that point, and they helped me to obtain compensation for the postmistress who had been evicted in my constituency. She was fully compensated, and it was with the help of the Federation. So I, thereafter, tended to have a very positive view about them and trusted their judgment.
You say here that Pole middle management was authoritarian, and you recognise the description of them applied by Sir Alan as thugs in suits. What about your dealings with them led you to those views?
Well, it was the description of what happened when, well, in the particular case I brought to Parliament, but I heard of others, about what happened when a postmaster made a mistake. I mean, in the case of my constituent, the only thing that we could identify was that a Twickenham resident had gone into the post office and found that the person behind the counter didn't know that Santiago was the capital of Chile. And a complaint had been made, and on the basis of this complaint, she had a franchise taken away from her. Certainly when I raised that issue and closures with the post office officials who I met around closures, the attitude came across to me very much as it was described here.
It was as a result of meeting them face to face.
It was indeed, and through the attitude that was revealed in correspondence at the time.
If we turn to the period when you took up office, that can come down from the screen, thank you. When were you first aware of individual sub-postmasters challenging the Post Office's enforcement action against them?
I wasn't aware of that at all. I knew that there were these fraud cases because, as I've mentioned, I had this delegation brought to me by Mr. Bridgen, and I had asked the Post Minister what action we were taking, and it was at that point that I was told about Second Sight, the forensic accountant, and I think reasonably assumed that there was now a process to deal with it. But that was the only occasion on which this came to my attention.
When did you first become aware that Post Office both investigated and privately prosecuted its own sub-postmasters and mistresses?
Well, I wasn't aware specifically about that differentiation. I think the kind of common way of looking at it was that if somebody was charged with fraud, it was all a matter to do with the police and the courts. The distinction that you draw and subsequently emerged was not something I was aware of.
Not aware of at any time in your period of office?
Well, I think right at the end, when we had this coming together of Mr. Arbuthnot's question in Parliament and the report of the Select Committee, I started to ask a lot of questions about what was going on, and I think that was one of the issues which emerged, but until then, the question had never arisen.
When did you first become aware of concerns that sub-postmasters had been prosecuted on the basis of Horizon data which may not be reliable?
Well, I think it was then, very much at the end of the Parliament, when we had that coincidence of events, and I was brought into the picture.
If we turn up your witness statement, please, at page 14. And paragraph 40, you say, in the course of preparing this statement, my attention has been drawn to an unsigned letter dated August 2012 to David Miliband, MP, apparently a draft prepared by officials on my behalf. I understand this letter to have been held by UKGI, and it is therefore reasonable to assume it was drafted by officials in the shareholder executive. The draft letter indicates it's a response to a letter from Mr. Miliband dated the 23rd of July 2012, which apparently enclosed a letter from his constituent, Kevin Carter. I've seen neither David Miliband's nor Kevin Carter's letter. You then quote from the letter, which I'll skip over. If we go over the page, please, and look at paragraph 41, you say, I've no recollection of this correspondence at all. I've not seen a signed and dated version of this letter, although it's fair to assume that someone in the department responded and did so along the lines of the draft referred to above. As David Miliband was a Privy Councillor, normally I would have been asked to sign the response as a matter of courtesy, although it was in the summer recess and you may not have been available. Can we look at the letter, please? UKGI 301 3690. And this is the draft letter to which you were referring in those paragraphs. And it begins, you'll see, by thanking Mr. Miliband for his letter of the 23rd, enclosing itself a letter from Mr. Carter, and continues, I've noted Mr. Carter's experiences and concerns as a sub-postmaster, but note that Post Office remains fully confident about the robustness and integrity of its Horizon system and related accounting processes. next paragraph, in the light of discussions with James Arbuthnot and a number of other MPs with ex-sub-postmaster constituents, Post Office recently agreed to an external independent review of a small number of individual cases that have been raised with them by several MPs. And if we go down, please. And we'll see it's got your name at the bottom, but as you say, you've not seen a signed version of this letter. For letters like this, would you read the letters before signing them?
Yes, I would, but maybe just explain a little bit of the background. I think the clue to this particular letter is in the date. It was August. I was rarely, if ever, in the department in August because that was the month I was sent on overseas visits to China, India, whatever, to negotiate trade and investment agreements. It was also the month I took short holidays with my wife. So I almost certainly never saw the letter or the incoming letter, but maybe it would help answer your question, I think, if I described the process by which correspondence was dealt with in my office and I personally related to. The situation...
Just before you do,
yes.
We've got a very detailed account from you in your witness statement as to how correspondence was dealt with. I just wanted to ask you a few questions about how correspondence was managed within the department and your private office.
Yes, well, I maybe can help with that. I mean, the problem was that I think that there were about several hundred letters a day and emails would come in addressed to me personally. I never saw them. They would be directed by the correspondence unit to the relevant civil servants who would prepare replies, either by other civil servants or by the postminister, and very, very occasionally to me, if there were a special reason, as Mr. Miliband was a Privy Councillor. And a letter of this kind would come to me probably in a folder, and it would be explained by the civil servants in my private office that this was a standard letter, that it had been agreed with the postminister's office. It was the departmental line, and all I needed to do was sign it because there was nothing controversial or difficult in it.
Just stopping there, Sir Vince, when you say it would have been explained by officials in your private office
Yes.
to you, in a covering submission or covering document or explained orally to you?
Well, I think in a case like this, there may not even have been a covering document because it was seen as a routine bit of correspondence. And I would sometimes have put in front of me a pile of letters for signing on totally different subjects. And I would be told, these are standard letters, you don't need to study them in the way that other controversial issues needed to be studied. I mean, if I'd had time and opportunity, I would almost certainly have spent as much time as I could reading them and absorbing them, but as I say, in this particular case, I almost certainly never saw the letter. And it would have been sent out by my office, PP'd on my behalf.
You see in the second paragraph, it refers to Post Office remaining fully confident about the robustness and integrity of the Horizon system and related accounting processes. What inquiries would you expect to have been undertaken and by whom, whether in private office, SHIEX or otherwise, in order to confirm or stand up what is said there?
Well, I would have expected, and I think I said this to you earlier, that when I first came into office, I would have expected to have been told that there were questions being raised about this system, both by Computer Weekly and by the Justice Group, but I wasn't. And all I was ever told was, and it appeared in letters and in annexes to briefs that I was given, that this was an issue that wasn't controversial. I mean, bear in mind, I think that like I think most politicians and most officials, I wasn't computer literate. If somebody had said to me that there was a problem of integrity in a computer system, I wouldn't have understood what on earth they meant. But So I was very reliant, as we all were, on the competence and integrity of the people who were giving advice.
My question was more, what inquiries would you expect, if any, officials to have carried out before recommending the inclusion of a line like this in a letter to be signed by you?
Well, I think the civil servants who dealt with this, I find it difficult to put myself in their minds. These were people who were working full-time on computer-related issues. I would certainly have expected them to consult somebody independent to have validated this claim, and probably to have taken time to interrogate the people who were offering criticisms, and it appears they were at that time. But no, I wasn't in their mind. It wasn't a subject I was remotely familiar with, and I had to accept and trust the advice I was given, because, I mean, that is ultimately how government works. You
Yes.
have to trust advice.
Would you have regarded it as sufficient if officials had lines provided for them by post office and simply incorporated those into letters that were to be sent out in your name or junior ministers' names without the kind of testing or challenge that you've just mentioned?
Well, there should have been a testing or challenge at some point, but that having established, as they seem to have done, that there wasn't a problem, it would have been reasonable then to have accepted the post office wording.
So you would have expected at some point a moment of challenge or deep investigation to occur,
Yes, I think that's reasonable.
in order to start up the use of the lines provided by Post Office about Horizon, even if thereafter the line was perpetuated without further investigation.
Yes, I would have expected an interrogation of the issue, of course.
In paragraph 31 of your witness statement, if we turn that up, please. It's on page 11. At the foot of page 11. You say, upon my appointment, I set 3 objectives for the department and ministers. And then if we go over the page, please. And the third of them, it hasn't got a C next to it, but I think it is the third of them, is to address the imbalance in the relationship between the post office and sub-postmasters, giving postmasters a greater say in the running of the network, and to advance in partnership with the Federation the idea of mutualisation. What lay behind your understanding that there was an imbalance in the relationship between the post office and sub-postmasters?
Well, it was based largely on my own personal experience, which I've already described to you, that I had called a debate in Parliament 10 years earlier, expressing my unhappiness with the way that postmasters were dealt with. And there was actually a broader policy issue which engaged me in the sense that I was responsible overall for competition policy. And there are in the country a whole set of cases where you have what you might call a monopoly. A technical word is monopsony, but sorry, I don't want to get into complex economics here, but where you had a powerful organization with large numbers of suppliers. And we had that situation, say, with farmers and supermarkets. We brought in legislation to protect the farmers. We did the same with publicans and pubcos, which absorbed a great deal of time and Joe Swinson's time. And I was aware that there was a similar problem with the post office, and I had thought at the outset we needed to change this situation. And the idea came up, I think it was Ed Davey in his discussions with the Federation, that the best way to deal with this problem was to create a mutual structure which would effectively put the postmasters in charge of the post office. It was an ambitious idea, and unlike the other two objectives, this didn't come to fruition, unfortunately. But that was where the idea came from.
Can we look, please, at poll 305 9303? And look at page 2, please. And scroll down a little further. You'll see this is a letter from Yasmin Qureshi, the then MP for Bolton South East. And if we go back to page 1, please, you'll see it stated the 25th of October 2012, and it's addressed directly to you. It concerns Chirag Patel. And if we just scroll down, please. If you just read to yourself what is said in the first 6 paragraphs.
Yes.
You'll see in the 7th paragraph it says the person who did the audit even says there was a problem with the computer because all the money in the post office was accounted for, and that it was not Mr. Patel. And then scrolling on, he had to pay £12,500, and then over the page. If you just read what's on that page. Yes. If we just go back to page 1, looking at the letter, is this the kind of letter that you would have seen yourself?
No.
And
as I've
in
explained,
this instance, why would you not have seen this type of letter?
Well, I never saw any of this kind of letter for the reasons I've described, because of the way the correspondence unit operated. There would be very large numbers of incoming letters. They were immediately sent to the relevant part of the department to prepare an answer, and the answer would come back through either a civil servant or through the post minister. In this case, it was judged that I didn't need to be involved, and certainly I never saw the letter. But the content of it is familiar, because the case I was familiar with in Twickenham sounded very similar to this, except that the IT dimension wasn't in evidence there. And it was the same kind of issue which was presented to me by the Federation when the representative met me with Mr. Bridgen.
One of your objectives was addressing the imbalance in the relationship between Post Office and its sub-postmasters. And this kind of complaint speaks to that very issue, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yes, I thought a lot about how you dealt with this question of imbalance. Well, the proposal I had made to Parliament 10 years earlier was that we did need to set up an arbitration mediation mechanism. You may say it was just serendipity, but this is ultimately what happened. And I certainly in my first meeting with Paula Venables, I had suggested that this is what the Post Office should do. But when I came into government and discussed this matter with Ed Davey and I think separately the Federation, we thought a more radical solution was required, and that's how the idea of mutualization came up. In retrospect, probably we should have been more modest and perhaps insisted that postmasters should be on the board of the post office. I believe this has now happened, but at the time they weren't directly represented. But that would have achieved some of the objectives of mutualisation without the full process, which took an inordinately long time.
Given that one of your three key objectives for Post Office was to address the imbalance in the relationship between Post Office and sub-postmasters, do you know why correspondence of this kind, which speaks to that very issue, was not flagged to you?
Well, I think the reason it wasn't flagged to me was the reason I gave in my earlier answers, that I had a vast portfolio. The civil servants in my private office and in department knew that this was, 1 or 2% of my workload, and clearly judged that they didn't need to deal with me, that if necessary, there was a post minister who would deal with it on my behalf. So it was a judgment on their part, was perfectly fair, that I simply would not have been able to cope with the volume of correspondence.
Can we look at some of the responses that junior ministers sent out? UKGI 301 3683, please. Thank you. And if we go to the bottom of the second page and the top of the third page, in fact, we can see it from that first page. We can see this is a letter sent out by Ed Davey MP. You can see it's to Norman Lamb, who ironically enough was subsequently to be Postal Affairs Minister, but here he's being written to in his capacity as a backbench MP. And here Ed Davey is replying to a letter that had been sent to you by Norman Lamb on behalf of his constituent, Alison Henderson, setting out her concerns about post office audit procedures and accusations levelled against sub-postmasters. I'm replying as Minister for Postal Affairs. And so there are a number of these. Just looking at what we have seen so far, is this what you would have expected to have happened, namely a letter coming into you from a backbench MP being passed to the Postal Affairs Minister to respond to?
Yes, I would have expected that was the process. I have to say, when I first came into government, I got a lot of complaints that MPs weren't getting answers, so I asked for more resources to beef up the correspondence unit. So the fact that proper letters were going out was in itself an advance on where we'd been before. But yes, I recognise the letter, and there are several messages in it which were, I think, fairly consistent and consistent with what I'd heard. For example, when I had held my debate in Parliament in 1999, the first thing that the Labour minister told me was, I can't deal with this because this is an operational matter, and operational matters are the responsibility of the Post Office. And the second issue, which was pointed out to me, is that there are legal issues involved, there are court cases. Ministers cannot get involved in matters relating to the criminal law. So ministers replying to letters were probably at each stage having to explain that.
You'll see that, as you say, in the second paragraph, it says the issues raised in that's Norman Lamb's letter, excuse me, are operational and contractual matters between Post Office and the postmistress, Mrs. Henderson. Neither I nor the department can intervene in cases which are sub judice or where court action has been determined. The constituent was charged to appear at Norwich Crown Court. She pleaded guilty to false accounting. And then it is said, I understand at no time during the case were any problems with Horizon's IT system raised by Mrs. Henderson or separately identified. That line there, that no problems with the IT system were raised by Mrs. Henderson at any time, we know to be false. She had raised in the course of the court proceedings on 2 occasions, including informal documents, her suggestion that the losses were caused by the IT system. For this kind of correspondence, what kind of inquiry would you expect officials to make before including in a letter information such as that?
Well, in a way, this is your earlier question in a different form.
It is.
Which is basically at the outset, there did need to have been an interrogation of the claim by the Post Office that there wasn't a problem, but that having been satisfied, as apparently the civil servants were, it was perfectly reasonable to incorporate that kind of comment in an outgoing letter.
This goes slightly further. It has a bit of a dig at Mrs. Henderson, saying it's all very well complaining now.
Yes.
She didn't complain when she had the opportunity to do so, namely in the court proceedings.
Yes.
What would you expect officials to do before, if anything, before including that kind of line in a letter?
Well, this is a level of detail. I'd never got involved in drafting and preparing letters of this kind, so how much detail? I think there is a serious point there, which is this issue about commenting on court cases.
Put that to one side for the moment. I'm asking you as the Secretary of State what you would expect officials to do before including this kind of content in a letter. If you say you don't know, you are not in a position to judge.
Well, this is a level of detail that I really can't make any useful comment on. As I said, I think it was incumbent on the officials in the department to have established in general terms that the Post Office were acting correctly, but having established that, it was not unreasonable for them to reproduce versions of events that they were given.
I.e. given by Post Office?
Yes.
And so you wouldn't see anything objectionable in if they were given that line by the Post Office simply to cut it into a letter?
Well, it is a little odd now you mention it, but I don't really have anything to add. I mean, this is at a very high level of detail, and I wasn't involved in drafting letters of this kind, so I can't really make any intelligent comment on it.
No, I know that you weren't involved. I'm just trying to explore with you whether before you or your ministers put their names to letters, you had an understanding of what had gone on in the back office. If somebody asked me to sign something,
Yeah.
I'll either want to know whether what's in it is true from my own personal knowledge or a little bit about the process which has gone into finding out the information and testing it.
Yes, well, I'd imagine that what happened was that the civil servants in BIS spoke to their opposite number in the Post Office and said, you know, can you give me the background to this case because I need to be able to give a full reply, and will you please tell me what happened in the case of Mrs. Henderson? Would, I think, simply on matters of fact, have had to trust the reply they were given.
Thank you. Can we look, please, at UKGI 3014038? March 2011, letter out from Ed Davey to Glenda Jackson. First paragraph thanking her for her letter of the 22nd of February 2011 to you on behalf of her constituent, Bhavisha Parekh, whose father was prosecuted for cash losses. It records that the constituent suggests that the Horizon computer system caused these losses. So again, similar to what we see before in terms of the architecture of the thing, letter into you, but letter out from Ed Davey.
Yes.
And that would be the system operating as it should.
Yes, that was how it worked.
And then just to see, there are quite a number of these letters, but just to see this is a repetition in the second paragraph. The issues raised in your letter are operational and contractual matters between Post Office, etc. Was that a line that you were familiar with, a line to take?
Yes, I was very familiar with that because that was exactly what I was told when I had raised cases in Parliament on behalf of the Postmaster. I think I had a 15-minute reply from the then Labour Minister, and first 5 minutes were explaining the legislation under which the Post Office operated, 69 Act, which made it very clear that they had responsibility for operational matters. And certainly when I think first met Paula Vendels, the first courtesy meeting, I explained my history, and I think she reminded me that this is exactly the way in which the relationship between me as a minister and her as a chief executive must operate.
You mentioned the 69 Act there. Are you referring to the Post Office Act 1969?
Yes, yes.
What did you understand that to say by the time of the years 2010 to 2015 as to operational independence?
Well, my understanding, which framed the way I dealt with issues, was that I had responsibility for the general kind of strategic direction of the Post Office and its financing, and that the Post Office were responsible for their relationships with individual postmasters and operational decisions about the opening and closing of post offices. That was how I saw the distinction.
We've got in our pack, thank you, that can come down, a series of letters. I'm just going to list them from MPs or constituents. I'll list them. One in October 2013, poll 0019-5964 at page 3. One December 2014, poll 0021-8852, pages 1 to 4. And one where the date isn't clear, poll 0034-4283. So letters in to you raising matters concerning the operation of the Horizon system and action taken against sub-postmasters. Would you expect anyone to, in your office or otherwise, to draw together correspondence which was of the same or substantially the same nature, i.e. was complaining about the same thing?
Well, I would have expected the operational civil service, not necessarily my private office, to have been alert to a systemic problem if there was one. But perhaps I just add another note, because the letters you're drawing to my attention are letters from MPs. I was very conscious from the outset that I didn't want to be caught in what you might call a Sir Humphrey situation of being blindsided by officials who had a biased view. So I set up in Parliament through my so-called PPS a system of surgeries so that MPs could come and talk to me on a Monday evening with or without officials present if there were any problems they had.
Just stopping you there, you explained some of this in your witness statement.
Yes.
Can you explain to those watching and listening what you mean by a Sir Humphrey situation?
Well, the fact that civil servants may have had a view of the world which was different from mine, and I needed to be aware of that. And that's why I set up this system. And people came to see me every week, MPs, on post office issues, not related to postmasters, but on post office issues. And I'm very surprised that in the whole of the 5-year period, with a single exception to Mr. Bridgen, who brought the Federation, who didn't raise the IT issue, why none of the MPs who were concerned about this ever came to talk to me about it. That was a way in which I could have challenged the officials, but I was never given the ammunition to do so.
Did you know that groups of MPs, quite a large number of MPs, were seeking to progress during your period of office the complaints of their constituents, led essentially by James Arbuthnot?
Well, I discovered this in March 2015. Before that, I wasn't aware of it, no.
And do you know, this may sound an awkward question, do you know why you weren't aware of it?
Well, optimistically, I would say it was because they had complete trust that the Post Minister was dealing with it properly. But I mean, the way Parliament worked was that I walked past Mr Arbuthnot and the other MPs several times a day, and if they were concerned, they would surely have stopped and said something to me. I mean, they did on other issues.
And sorry, Sir Vince, are you saying there that James Arbuthnot was not concerned because he didn't raise the matter with you?
No, I've read about his work, and it was monumental. And he did an enormous amount of good work. But for whatever reason, the MPs who were concerned about this issue never raised it with me in Parliament. They had abundant opportunities to do so.
You're not being critical of them for failing.
No, I'm not at all.
So. You're saying they simply took a different route.
They took a different route, and different MPs operate in different ways. No, I'm not remotely critical. They, particularly Lord Arbuthnot, as is now, obviously did a heroic job. I wouldn't dare to criticise him.
Were you aware that essentially a boilerplate reply was being sent out in response to each and every one of these letters in from MPs that were being sent to you?
Well, I wasn't aware of the letters coming in or going out, but yeah, it clearly was a boilerplate response. But that was actually how government dealt with most issues. Government had to have a line on issues, and having established it, reproduced it. It would, of course, chaos if there'd been a different response to every individual.
The alternative view might be that having a boilerplate response and sticking to it means that there's never any real investigation of the issues.
Well, as I've said several times already, I think there should have been at some point a careful interrogation of the issues, but having established a clear line of argument, it was entirely appropriate to be consistent in dealing with everybody who wrote in about it.
Can I turn to the second issue then, the second site investigations and the mediation scheme? Can we turn to paragraph 46 of your witness statement? Which is on page 17. You say, I'm told that on the 8th of July 2013, the second site interim report was published. I was not aware of this report or its contents at the time. When did you first hear about the second site investigation and its interim report?
Well, I don't think I did, except I did meet, the ministers on a very regular basis. They may well have said in the course of reporting to me on what they were doing that this forensic investigation was taking place and was proceeding normally. But I certainly was never given a formal, detailed report on the work of Second Sight. I only heard about it when I had this visit from Mr. Bridgen and the Federation, and I wanted to follow it up and asked the Post Minister what was going on, and they told me that the Second Sight investigation was taking place. I didn't realise, incidentally, that it was an IT investigation. I thought it was just a general investigation into why so many postmasters were being charged with fraud and losing their post offices.
When were you first aware that Second Sight were undertaking an investigation?
Well, when I told the Post Minister that I'd had this delegation, and I was very worried about it and the numbers of people and the distress of some of the cases, And I said, what are we doing about this? And she said, I think it was Joe Swinson at that time, we have just launched this forensic audit investigation, and I'm sure that all your cases will have been dealt with properly.
Would that be in the course of her first period of office, 6th of September 2012 onwards?
Yes, I'm sure it was. It may not even have been Joe. It may have been, I think, Norman Lamb briefly. But no, from memory, I think it was Joe's time.
If we look, please, at UKGI 301 3690. We can see the letter from you to David Miliband. If we just look on the fourth paragraph, nevertheless, in the third paragraph, nevertheless, in the light of discussions with James Arbuthnot and a number of MPs, Post Office recently agreed to an external independent review of a small number of individual cases that have been raised by them. That's, I think, a reference, would you agree, to the
Yes.
Second Sight
Yes.
investigation. And so you signing this letter off in August 2012.
Well, as I've said, I didn't sign it off.
No. So you simply would never have seen this.
Almost certainly.
Didn't see the letter in, didn't see the letter out.
Almost certainly not.
So we can't take this as knowledge by you of Second Sight at
No,
this time.
absolutely not.
Can we look, please, then, at UKGI 301 9389? And look at the bottom of the page, please. And over to the second page. Can you see an email dated the 22nd of July 2013 from Cable MPST? Is that your private office's email
Yes,
address?
it is, yeah.
To the private office of Joe Swinson and others within SHIEX. And the subject is Postmaster's news story. Can you see that?
Yes.
And it says, hi, all, Vince has seen this news article and thought it was a good news story for the Post Office and good link to the trust and transparency work. Any suggestions what we can do to take this forward? Thanks, Anna. And was she one of your private secretaries?
I don't remember there were a lot of private secretaries. I don't remember an Anna, but I'm sure it was, yes.
We can see the highlight, the second highlight is the attachment, Sub-Postmaster's News Story .pdf. Can we look at that, please? UKGI 301 9390. You may recognise the style and the font and text. It's an extract from Private Eye.
Yes.
And it reads, last, some encouraging news for sub-postmasters who've been sacked, sued and even jailed over shortfalls that show up on the Post Office's Horizon system. The interim report of a review of the IT system following a campaign by Tory MP James Arbuthnot sets out a raft of failings. These include the brutal way the Post Office investigated financial errors, unreliable hardware, the absence of training or support for sub-postmasters on a system said to be more complex than that of a high street bank, and an unfair business model which automatically makes sub-postmasters responsible for any discrepancy. These failings have led to false accounting prosecutions, as inexperienced individuals with unexplained discrepancies have been faced with either reporting false figures or losing their business, nowhere else to turn. Arbuthnot has supported the Post Office on the open way in which, through the review, it has allowed the flaws to be exposed. But the next big test is whether scores of people who've lost their livelihoods and sometimes liberty will win any redress. Now, it seems from the covering email that you had read the article.
Well, I'd seen it, yes.
What's the difference between seeing and reading?
Well, the difference is that I was given every morning a pack of 30 or 40 press cuttings, everything relating to the department, and I would normally judge from the gist of it, the headlines, whether this was something we in the department needed to react to in some way. That was part of my job, was to be conscious of the public impact of what we were doing, and I just glanced at this one, and it did refer to the brutal way the Post Office investigates. I thought, well, you know, this chimes with what I know.
Do you recall now only glancing at it?
Yes, I'm sure I only glanced at it. I only glanced at almost all of the press cuttings. And it wasn't an important part of the day's routine. It was just picking up important issues. And I just noticed that I'd been lecturing businesses on how they needed to be much more transparent about how they dealt with consumers and workers and so on. And here was somebody who'd been a critic of the government saying that actually a government agency under our remit was doing a good job. So I thought, oh, yeah, why don't we make more of this? And as you see from the private office response, they were at pains to dampen my enthusiasm because they realized that this was a complex issue. So I think we simply moved on and I didn't take it any further.
We'll come to all of those steps in a moment. You'll see the article says that the interim report, which is a reference to the 8th of July 2013 Second Sight report, sets out a raft of failings, the brutal way Post Office investigated errors, unreliable hardware, the absence of training or support, an unfair business model leading to false accounting prosecutions, leading to people losing their business with nowhere else to turn. Why did you think this was a good news story?
Well, I thought it was a good news story because I'd simply picked up the fact that I think it says Mr. Bothnott applauded the Post Office on the open way in which it allows these flaws to be exposed. I mean, I didn't read it carefully. It wasn't a policy document. It was just one of 30 press cuttings that I glanced at, but I'd picked up that somebody was saying something positive about the department and the agencies we're responsible for. Most of the press coverage was negative. I mean, that's the way the way of government. And here, at a quick glance, was something positive, so I suggested to the press office, maybe I should take this a bit further.
Looking back at the email, please, UKGI 301 9389. See the reply. So again, it's from Anna Bartholomew, a private secretary in your office. So she's essentially replying to her own email with the same distribution list. She says, I have spoken to officials working on Post Office and compiled the following advice for you. This will go in the box tonight with the article. Officials recommend not following up on the article. It prevents a very skewed picture and doesn't cover all the facts. The interim report clearly said that there was no evidence of systemic failures or flaws, whereas the report suggests the Post Office has admitted to system errors. There were two minor discrepancies which Post Office identified and rectified independently of the report. This affected a very small proportion of the network. No sub-postmasters lost money. Arbuthnot is closely involved in the investigation and provided a channel for the submission of individual cases. Although the article correctly refers to him applauding the Post Office on the open way it responded to the allegations, there remain significant differences in opinion. Following publication of the interim report, he tabled an urgent question requiring a government statement, despite conversations with Joe Swinson, to explain the operational nature of the issue. With regard to the possibility of redress, it must be remembered that prosecutions were subject to the judicial process There's no automatic redress and nothing the government should or could intervene on. Additionally, a number of the sub-postmasters pleaded guilty. This is only an interim report. So essentially pouring cold water of a different kind or a different variety in a number of ways on your idea to take forwards what you had read.
Yes, it was, obviously.
And are you able to recall whether that's what happened?
No, I don't recall this episode at all, but we've had this kind of discussion constantly about kind of public relations, communications issue, about how to deal with them, and I got the point fairly quickly that this was something the press office and the officials didn't want to make something of, so I deferred to their judgment on public relations grounds. I certainly didn't study the content of this minute in any detail.
What about studying the report, saying, can I see the report? There's obviously a difference of view here.
Well, I could have done, but I think it didn't ring a bell at the time that this was an issue. As I say, it was just, I was focusing on a different question, which is the fact that the government and government agencies were being more transparent. I thought that was the theme of the issue, rather than getting into a debate about what the government was actually doing in relation to the second site. So I saw it entirely as a rather simple one-line PR issue, and I was warned off it, and as I often was, and took no further action on it.
Would you expect to have been provided with a copy of the report by your officials?
Not necessarily. Independently of this press issue, it was proceeding under the overall oversight of the Post Minister. I had no reason to believe that it wasn't being well handled by her, and indeed it was being well handled. So I didn't need to see the report, and nobody suggested that I read it.
Would you expect to be provided with an impartial and objective summary of the report?
Not necessarily, depending on whether it was potentially controversial and might lead to difficult decisions. But this was, I think, goes back to the earlier part of our exchange, that this was a very small part of my portfolio. I left it to the discretion of my private office and my ministerial colleagues to decide what was sufficiently important to bring to me, and they clearly judged that this wasn't necessary.
You had, it seems, seen or read the Private Eye article and realised that it raised an issue of substance.
Well, I'd seen the Private Eye article. I didn't realise that it had raised an issue of substance, no.
Why did you not realise that it raised an issue of substance?
Well, because I probably glanced at it in 2 or 3 seconds. That was the way I had to deal with press cuttings. As I say, it was a very rapid exercise, took 10 minutes in a morning, and I would just pick up, usually from headlines, what were the issues in the news that I needed to be abreast of.
And is that why you focused on it being a good news story rather than all of the parts of the article?
Yes, exactly right.
Which point in the other direction?
Yes, exactly.
So it's 11 o'clock now. I wonder whether we might take the first morning break until 10 past 11.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. Good morning, sir. Can you continue to see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So, Vince, in your witness statement, you tell us in paragraph 61, 68, 69, 76 and 77 about some letters that you received from James Arbuthnot,
right,
MP, and Adrian Bailey, MP, on the 11th and the 17th of March 2015. I'd like to just look at those, please, and see what happened in relation to them. Yeah. These are about the second site investigations and the mediation scheme and a report that they were publishing. or providing. Can we look, please, at the first letter in, UKGI 403781? Can we see this is from James Arbuthnot? It's dated the 11th of March 2015 to you. And scroll down, please. He says, in PMQs today, the Prime Minister told me that he would ask you to write to me about the Post Office mediation scheme. While there are many things that are very worrying about it, what particularly concerns me is that the Post Office has recently been refusing to give Second Sight the documents and information that Second Sight feel they need in order to determine whether a miscarriage of justice has occurred. I believe that the only legal folder, for example, that Second Sight has seen is that relating to my constituent, Joe Hamilton. But that folder did show that there was no evidence, as the Post Office knew at the time, of theft. Yet the Post Office charged her with theft. And as a result, she then pleaded guilty to false accounting, having untruthfully been told that she was the only person going through these difficulties. That suggests to me there is more disclosure of documents that needs to take place, and our constituents will never believe that the truth has been reached without that disclosure. Equally, that disclosure needs to be made to Second Sight, who have now built up the expertise to deal with it. And if we look at the letter in from Mr. Bailey, poll 00176637. Page 3 and 4, please. Maybe if we just pan out a bit. 17th of March 2015, to you, dear Secretary of State. As you'll be aware, on the 3rd of February, the BIS committee heard evidence on the Post Office mediation scheme. During this session, we were concerned to hear that the mediation scheme was not operating in the matter envisaged when it was established. I was pleased to hear that since our evidence session, Post Office has agreed to take most cases forward to mediation. However, I have a number of specific concerns regarding Post Office's approach to the mediation process, which I expect the government to be actively involved in addressing in order to ensure they do not cause further issues in the future. And then Mr. Bailey lists them. I'm not going to go through them. You tell us in your witness statement that you replied to both letters, indicating that you had read both letters and your responses in detail, and that you did not accept your private office's advice that you should approve the revised draft of the letters out without reading them, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I only became aware of these when I was asked to sign an outgoing letter.
Yes.
And of course, they're different sources. One is Mr. Arbuthnot, the other is the Select Committee, but in my mind, they were dealing essentially with the same set of issues. And I got a draft letter from officials, and I wasn't happy with it. It was partly, I think, stylistic. I thought we should be a little bit more deferential, respectful to these senior gentlemen, but I think more a substance that I read the letter and I realized that it entirely hinged on accepting the view of the Post Office. And I said, well, are the postmasters happy with this? I mean, that whole mediation scheme was for their benefit. So do they accept it? And so I said, I want you to go. I asked the officials, who clearly wanted me to sign this in a hurry because we were almost at the end of the Parliament. I said, look, I want to be satisfied that the postmasters share the view of the Post Office about this question. So I declined to sign the letter until I'd been given evidence on that point.
And just on that point, you said that the reason for you not following your advice was that the draft that had been supplied to you depended on the accuracy entirely of that which the Post Office was saying.
Yes, and
a number of the earlier letters that have gone out also depended entirely upon the accuracy of what the Post Office was saying. What differentiated differentiated this occasion for you to say, hold on, I'm not signing that draft?
Well, the difference, I'm not sure that I did commit myself in quite the same way earlier, but anyway, what happened here was that I realized that there's something really rather important and bad going on, because it isn't just a campaigning MP. This is the select committee who were there to have oversight of what I did, being very critical of the department. So I needed to really concentrate on the issue and think about it. And I think it was only in March 2015 I realized there was something really seriously bad going on. It was actually quite difficult. I mean, I remember this period quite clearly because I was in the middle of a crisis, the last big crisis of my period in office, where I was having to decide about the export of weapons to Saudi Arabia that were being used to bomb civilians. And I was keeping awake at night because either I'd have blood on my hands or I'd make a decision that would have put large numbers of British workers out of work. So I was totally preoccupied with that problem. And in the middle of it, I was being asked to sign letters about this mediation scheme. So I needed time to think about it, and I refused to sign the first draft for the reasons I've just given you.
Can we look at the drafts that you did sign? UKGI 303910. This is the letter back to James Arbuthnot, dated the 17th of March. I'm writing to you further to your question to the Prime Minister regarding the Post Office mediation scheme on Wednesday last week and your subsequent letter. I appreciate you raising your concerns about the mediation scheme in general, but particularly regarding your constituent, Mrs. Jo Hamilton, who I understand has a case in the scheme. I must first of all reiterate that the mediation scheme is independent of government and decisions relating to the scheme or its operation are matters for the parties involved and not for the government. And then, if we go over the page, please. If you look at the penultimate paragraph at the foot of the page, you conclude by saying, I note through Second Sight's report and the subsequent investigations, there is no evidence of system-wide problems with Horizon, and that conclusion has stood firm through nearly 2 years of investigation. As such, the priority must be to ensure that those applicants remaining in the scheme can have their cases considered swiftly and fairly. I hope that all parties will continue to work constructively to ensure this can happen. That sentence, or those sentences, there is no evidence of system-wide problems with Horizon, and that conclusion has stood firm through nearly 2 years of investigation. Was that a suggestion put to you by officials?
Well, it was, but I wanted, because I was confronting the issue really for the first time, I wanted reassurance from the postmasters that that was indeed the case, and I had asked the officials to check with the Federation whether this was indeed their understanding, and I was told that it was, and that the General Secretary or the head of the union had appeared before the Select Committee and has said he was satisfied that there was no problem. So I was now being told by the officials, the Post Office and the union that there wasn't a problem. So it seemed to me perfectly reasonable for me to accept that collective view.
Was that, in your mind, the critical turning point, the views expressed by the, I think, the General Secretary of the NFSP?
Yes, it was. I had dealt with them before.
Had you dealt with him?
Not with him. Well, he'd met me, I think, on a couple of courtesy calls.
And sorry, just to make clear, who are you referring to?
Sorry, my first dealings with the Federation 15 years earlier had been with Mr. Baker,
Colin Baker, yes.
My second interaction had been when a representative, I'm not sure who it was, whether it was Mr. Thompson or a regional head, had come to see me about individual cases. And I had met Mr. Thompson, I think, on a couple of occasions. He'd come to talk about the progress of the transformation programme and the progress we were making on mutualisation. So that was the extent of my dealings with the union. But
Had he in your dealings with him, ever struck you as a tool?
absolutely
Meaning
not.
a tool of the post office?
Absolutely not. All my dealings with the Federation and him personally, it struck me as people of high integrity and who believed in what they were doing, as trade union officials do. I had no reason to doubt their integrity whatever.
Did you not need to see Second Sight's report in order to include a sentence or sentences such as these in the letter?
Well, I think given time, I probably would have done and should have done, but I think the context was that within a day or so of the end of Parliament, I was being pressed by the officials to get this letter out. I think even when I was given the reassurance about the Federation's view, I declined still to sign it because I was beginning to smell a rat. I mean, there was something going on here. And had Parliament continued, or had I been returned to office, I would have got all these people around the table, the Select Committee, Mr. Arbuthnot, the Post Office people, and for the first time, Mr. Bates. I'd not heard of him till this point, and I'd have got them all around the table and asked, what the hell's going on here? But I didn't have the time to do that, and I had to make a snap judgment about whether to send out this letter.
Can we look at the reply to Mr. Bailey, please? Poll 303-9281. Can you see 26th of March? And then if we just go over the page to page 2, excuse me, signed by you. And then if we go back, please, to page 1. Thank you for your letter. I'm grateful to the committee for considering this matter. Pleased to provide a response attached to the letter. It's important to reiterate that the mediation scheme is independent of government, given that the cases in the scheme are disputes between independent business people and the Post Office, excuse me, and are, of course, sensitive and confidential. It would not be appropriate for government to intervene or seek to influence the outcome. Is that what you understood you were being asked to do, to influence outcomes?
No, I think that wasn't the part of the letter that I was focusing on. It was the implication that the Horizon scheme was or wasn't functioning properly. I hadn't, as I explained to you before the break, I hadn't been given any briefing about the Second Sight and the mediation process. I was, I suppose, privately pleased that the suggestion I'd made 15 years earlier about setting up a mediation process was actually happening. The fact that it had not gone in an ideal way was not something I was aware of till that point.
Then there's the line, since the issues were first raised over 2 years ago, the system has been under considerable scrutiny, and it remains the case there's no evidence of systemic problems with Horizon. That conclusion has stood firm through independent investigation by Second Sight. And then the vast majority of sub-postmasters continue to use Horizon successfully every day in operating their branches. There are fewer than 150 cases in the mediation scheme, whilst there have been around 500,000 users who've worked with Horizon since its introduction. It processes over 6 million transactions every working day. Is that a line, a comparison of the said to be small number of cases where individuals were raising a problem versus the number of users and the number of transactions that was put to you by officials as an important point?
Yes, it almost certainly was. I mean, it's an issue that troubles me, and I'm sure the inquiry to this day about those of us who don't really understand computers and computer systems is why it works almost all the time, but in some cases not, with disastrous consequences. I mean, it needed somebody, I think, to explain why.
Did anyone ever explore that with you? Or
No, I wish they had. I wish they had.
And suggest that it doesn't really matter if there's a large number of OK transactions, because
No,
if,
it
if
clearly
you're,
ma-
hold on, if you let me finish, Sir Vince.
Sorry.
If you're the person that's been sent to prison whilst pregnant, if you're the person that has committed suicide, if you're the person who has been made bankrupt, it doesn't matter that quite a few other people have been getting on fine with the computer.
Of course it matters. It matters immensely, and enormous harm was done. I think the problem, as I was just trying to explain, for policymakers is who don't understand anything about computers and computer systems is how it is that they seem to work almost all the time, but not all the time. I mean, there's a concept here which I still struggle to get my head around, why this was the case.
We've received a lot of evidence on precisely that issue,
Yeah.
and the inquiry understands how that occurs,
Yes.
concerning code regression and the combination of a set or a series of circumstances which, when they interact with each other, can lead to undesirable outcomes.
Well, indeed, I've read about that, but it would have been helpful when I was in government for somebody to have explained how that was possible. I believe the Computer Weekly people had some insight into it, but I wasn't aware of their existence. And Mr. Bates, too, it was only then, March 2015, I was aware of his existence, and he may have been able to explain that.
Can we turn, please, to poll 00153177? And page 15, please. It's the top two paragraphs. We don't actually have the Computer Weekly article that's here quoted, and so I'm using this as a source of the information. This briefing note says that in the top paragraph that James Arbuthnot has been the most vocal of a group of 140 MPs campaigning for redress. Speaking to Computer Weekly this week, he expressed disappointment that a written answer to his question during Prime Minister's questions on the 11th of March, which subsequently came from you, followed the Post Office's line closely. In response to the written answer to his question, written by you, Arbuthnot told Computer Weekly, quote, "The Secretary of State has chosen to listen carefully to his advisers and the Post Office on this matter, rather than seeking to understand why over 140 of his fellow MPs have outstanding cases and unresolved concerns about the matter. This is a shame. I remain quietly confident that the truth will be revealed in due course, and I intend to pursue this matter until that happens." Do you agree that 140 outstanding cases or 140 MPs having outstanding cases represented a significant number?
Yes, it is. It's appalling.
Was Mr. Arbuthnot's statement that you had listened to the Post Office and had not sought to understand why 140 fellow MPs have outstanding cases accurate?
No, I hadn't just listened to the Post Office. That's the whole point of what I was telling you, that I only agreed to support the official line on this when I was reassured that the people who represented the postmasters were content. It wasn't based on an acceptance of the Post Office view at all. I would never have signed it if that was all I was asked to do. And I would just add a point which I think we did discuss briefly before, that what is strange about this whole episode is that none of these 140 MPs ever came to talk to me about it. I had some of them coming to talk to me in the privacy of my House of Commons office about post office issues like the last bank in town, where the post office were not being very proactive. Nobody came to talk to me about the post office. And for example, the chairman of the select committee, who I knew very well and respected, was a very good parliamentarian, had actually come to see me a few weeks before this episode. And all he wanted to talk to me about was about the pub legislation, and never raised the issue about postmasters. So I think I could be forgiven for not understanding the weight of this 140 MP campaign, because none of them ever talked to me about it.
He wrote you a detailed letter setting out his and the committee's concerns.
Yes, but I think...
Is that not enough?
And certainly wasn't. No, I think all MPs realised that writing polite letters to departments isn't necessarily the way to get through to people at the top of government. You have to talk to them face to face.
And so you do blame them for failing to come and see you?
I'm not blaming them. I say different people had different styles. Some people operated through the formal processes of Parliament, others didn't. No, it's not a question of blame. As I say, I had a great, having seen the mountain of work that they did, have enormous respect for them. But it was, let's just say it was unfortunate that I never had any personal contact with the MPs about this matter.
Would the outcome have been different? Is that what you're saying, Sir Vince?
Yes, I think it probably would have been.
In what way?
Well, because I would have realised much earlier than March 2015 that there were serious problems that were not being properly addressed by the Post Office and the department. And I would have started to interrogate it much more aggressively, as I did on quite a lot of other issues where MPs came to see me.
Don't you think you would have been provided with exactly the same post office lines by officials, and they would have been sent out in the same way as we've seen?
I might well have been, and it might well have led to the same conclusion, but I would have been more alert to the challenge that was being made in Parliament.
Can we go towards the end of this episode and look at paragraph 79 of your witness statement on page 33? Page 33, paragraph 79. On the 15th of April 2015, my private office was copied into an email from Laura Thompson, she's a SHE-X official, to the BIS communications team concerning the imminent publication of the second report. It essentially said that the report was about to be published. Post Office considered it to be of poor quality and had prepared a response, that the report would be provided to BIS in line with my response to the BIS Select Committee. There may be some media interest. My private office responded to say that you had noted the concerns of the email and was grateful for the update. By this time, Parliament was dissolved and preparations were underway for the general election. You were unable to take non-urgent decisions. Can we just look at that exchange, please? UKGI 404225. Go to page 4, please. Email 15th of April, Laura Thompson, to, amongst others, your private office. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Hannah Ashley. We expect the next development in the Post Office Horizon issue to happen tomorrow or possibly Friday. Second Sight have completed their final report into the matter. Report will be issued to all remaining applicants later today. Post Office advised that the report is poor, containing unsubstantiated allegations and misrepresentations. They are issuing their own response to the report alongside it. The report is designed to inform those applicants in the scheme awaiting mediation. It's not designed to be published. Once it's received by applicants, it will be leaked. Post Office anticipate this will happen, are prepared to release the report in full alongside its response to journalists on requests. Post Office will send a copy of the report and their response to BIS later today. This is in line with the commitment that you made in your letter to the BIS committee last month. I understand from Post Office that while the report does not make any particularly new accusations, it still contains criticism of Post Office, and these could be picked up by interested parties, probably Nick Wallace from the One Show. However, it is important to note that the report maintains the conclusion there are no systemic flaws in Horizon capable of causing the issues that have been claimed. Your office, I think, was told to direct all calls to Post Office and seek Post Office lines. Is that right?
It appears so, yes.
Would you have seen this email chain?
I doubt it. It's possible. There was a great flurry of activity in the last few days of Parliament, but I think the judgment would be that my sending those letters to Mr. Arbuthnot and the Select Committee was the end of my involvement, but it's possible I was shown.
So this being the last days of Parliament, or a Parliament, it affected the extent of your involvement?
Yes, and indeed the issue I referred to earlier around Saudi Arabia was absorbing more and more of my time, and I think my officials understood I had to focus on that.
Would anything be done in those circumstances to alert the new Secretary of State, if there was going to be a new Secretary of State, as to the issues that weren't being addressed because of the ending of this Parliament?
Well, I guess I was hoping I would be the new Secretary of State and I would have an opportunity to deal with this issue properly. I mean, I'd realised, as I've just said to you, that there was something bad happening. I tried to respond to it as best I could. I think the rational approach of an incoming Secretary of State, who I hoped would be me, would be to get the various parties together, including Mr. Bates, who I'd heard of for the first time, the critics of the Post Office in Parliament, in order to thrash out why these discrepancies in interpreting the work of the computer and the mediation system had arisen. I mean, part of my role as Secretary was convening. And I think what I should have done and would have done, had there been time, would have been to have dealt with the matter in that way.
Thank you. That can come down. You tell us in your witness statement, it's paragraph 140, that the Post Office Board was, in retrospect, clearly a failure. I wish I had spent more time thinking about the role and constitution of the board and whether it was doing its job properly. Can you tell us in greater detail, please, what you think you should have spent more time doing concerning the role and constitution of the Post Office Board?
Well, in retrospect, we know that bad things were happening in the Post Office and that the board were the people who would have surfaced any disquiet and reported it back to ministers, if necessary, me. And so there was a failure at that level. As to what I could have done about it, I think, as I said earlier, I was wanting to change the institutional arrangement so that the postmasters had a bigger voice. And an easy way of doing it would have been to have insisted that postmasters and their representatives were put on the board. At the time, it hadn't occurred to me to do that, but I know it's now being done.
You tell us in paragraphs 141 and 142 of your witness statement that, quote, I should have also noticed that there was something wrong about Paula Venables and Alice Perkins attending meetings together, where Alice Perkins was supposed to be supervising and independently scrutinising the Post Office's executive team's performance. On these issues, though, it's fair to ask whether it's really for a Secretary of State to be surfacing these issues, or for the officials in SHIEX whose focus was the post office? Firstly, can you tell us what the something wrong might be about two individuals, one the chairman and the second a CEO, attending a meeting at the same time?
Well, I suppose it's observations that have come from later years. Now, since I've left politics, I'm involved in a non-executive director role in companies, and I'm directly confronted with this whole issue of Cadbury principles in business and the separation of roles of chairs and chief executives. I probably hadn't appreciated at the time why that was important. The chair and the chief executive, when they came to see me, and I think it was only on 2 or 3 occasions on courtesy calls, were a double act. And, and in one sense, it's, understandable that the chair would want to give encouragement to the chief executive in delivering our big program of transformation. That's understandable, but I think I now appreciated, having had personal responsibility for corporate governance, that there is a separation of roles, and it might have been better in hindsight if they had separated the roles themselves.
Did you ever have concerns about the competency of the post office's senior management?
No, I didn't. As I think I mentioned earlier, I think at my first ever meeting with Paula Venables, I told her I didn't think much about post office management. I'd had very negative views about them, and I'd recommended, I think, that she should read my Hansard report and think about it. But she had nothing to do with that. She came much later, and I certainly had no reason to believe that she and her senior colleagues were a problem.
Was it ever escalated to you that members of the board, individuals within SHIEX, and some ministers had concerns about her competence and abilities?
No, it was never communicated to me.
Did the consistent complaints from sub-postmasters that were addressed to your department not cause you to have concerns about post office's management?
Well, I didn't know about the volume of them. As I say, the one occasion when an MP brought the Federation to me concerned, I think, 100 postmasters, which was 1% of the total, I think, something of that order of magnitude. Indeed, I asked the question at the time of my officials, would they do some research into whether a 1% prosecution rate was abnormal in franchise networks. I said go to Londis and Spar and so on and ask if this is normal. And the message came back to me that it was normal and there was nothing worrisome about it. So the fact that my limited knowledge of complaints didn't suggest to me that at that point that there was a failing top management.
Can we turn lastly to some reflections that you make at the end of your witness statement? Yeah. It's page 51 and paragraph 144. You say you have naturally reflected on what lessons can be learned from the post office scandal. A few thoughts, and you set out 5 of them. First, the relationship between the post office and postmasters was and is highly unequal. In comparable situations, you promoted legislation establishing independent regulators to protect the weaker parties. You've mentioned that already. In the case of the post office, a different approach was tried, but for a variety of reasons it did not work. In future, an independent regulator arbitrator should be appointed. Can you expand, please, on what you mean by an independent regulator and arbitrator?
Well, I can't expand a great deal because it was a sort of concept. And we actually, as we now know, the Second Sight project led to a form of arbitration or dispute settlement, which didn't work because the details were wrong. So that the concept was tried and didn't work brilliantly well. But I think in the other cases I had taken action in respect of pubs and supermarkets. A setup had worked, the difference being that we were dealing here with a state agency, and to have introduced that kind of arrangement, I would have been asking to set up an arrangement where the government would have to investigate complaints into government, which would have been a rather circular process. But I think the concept of having a entirely independent arbitration process is right, though of course the details also need to be right.
You say, secondly, a related point is that UK competition law is forced on a distortion of competition resulting in detrimental impacts on consumers. It doesn't address market imbalances between large corporations and smaller subcontractors or franchises. Consideration should be given excuse me, to addressing this. And can you expand, please, on what you have in mind there?
Well, I think the answer is the one I've just given to you, that one of the things I'd done as a minister was to set up these regulatory bodies for industries where this was a common problem, which was agriculture and supermarkets and pubs and pubsco. And in introducing the legislation, it proved to be a lot more complicated than I'd realized when I was putting the idea out in general terms. But I think we should be looking at those models and applying it, drawing on those lessons to apply it in the case of the post office.
Over the page, please.
Before we go on, Mr. Beer, can I just ask one question about the first subparagraph, just to clear my mind? So Vince, as you're probably aware, that the mediation scheme in 2013 to 2015 was just that, in the sense that the parties, in effect, were free to choose whether to accept what the mediator was trying to achieve. Does your phrase independent regulator stroke arbitrator convey to me that you think there should be some kind of scheme which in effect imposes a solution on the postmasters and the post office, whether they like it or not?
No, that's exactly what I envisaged.
Fine. All right. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Over the page to 3, please. You say the experience of Horizon has been that post office management, officials, ministers did not understand the workings and limitations of complex advanced computer systems. There have been many other failures, as in the NHS. There's a case for government departments and entities like the post office to have a board-level technology officer who is legally responsible for validating the integrity of technology systems in the same way that the permanent secretary is the accounting officer and company chief finance officers are responsible for accounts. Legally responsible, do you mean through legislation?
Yes, not that the individual would be subject to prosecution. No, indeed through legislation. I mean, I was just attracted to this idea because of the experience I had with the permanent secretary, who was the accounting officer for BIS. And if there was something wrong in the accounts of the department, he would be hauled up before the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee. So there was a real accountability here. There is analogous behaviour in the private sector, obviously, with due diligence. And I thought, since very few people in public life have any understanding of computers and systems, there needed to be somebody who was properly qualified, knowledgeable, who would take that level of responsibility. Because, I mean, some companies and government departments stand or fall by whether their technology is working. And so having a specific line of accountability would, in my view, be useful.
Thank you. Fourthly, there appears to have been a failure of governance inasmuch as the board failed to identify a serious failure and alert ministers to it. when government appoints members of boards, supervisory boards of this kind, it's important that members are aware that their primary duty is to protect the wider public interests. This may involve creating a bespoke corporate structure with specific legislative underpinning. A couple of questions on that. You say that when the government appoints members to a board, it's important that that member is aware that their primary duty is to protect the wider public interest.
Yeah.
Do you establish that? Do you say that that is established already? That that was the member's duty?
I think it is implicit, but I think it was obvious.
Implicit how? I'm so sorry.
Was in this case, of course, there was a government representative on the board.
Yes.
But he or she was, I think, probably looking in terms of the public interest, in terms of spending £2 billion of taxpayers' money and making sure it was properly and effectively spent. But there were other public obligations, and welfare of postmasters being one of them, and it was quite difficult for one shareholder representative to carry out different, possibly on occasions conflicting aspects of public interest. So I think we probably hadn't thought through how these different aspects of public interest were best captured in the composition of the board.
So the first question, your answer to the first question is, you think it was established that Mr. Callard's primary duty was to protect the wider public interest?
Yes, I think so. We can debate, academically about what public interest means, but yes, I think that was clearly the case.
And why do you think that was clearly established, that his duty was to protect the wider public interest, rather than to be to hold and discharge the duties that any other board member held?
Well, because he was there to represent the government, and the government represents the public interest. We say we can debate the different components of public interest, but he was the government was the shareholder. He was there to represent the government, and the government, in a democracy, is there to represent the wider public interest.
Do you think that was obvious at the time?
No, it wasn't probably obvious, and maybe, as I've said in this note, we should have been and should be thinking a little bit more about the composition of the board.
You say, secondly, that this would involve creating a bespoke corporate structure with specific legislative underpinning. Do you have this idea in mind in relation to the whole range of public corporations in which the government is a shareholder?
Well, I don't want to redesign government, but we know from the private sector sometimes you have two-tier boards, which is necessary to capture the variety of stakeholder interest. I mean, when we're talking about public corporations, we're talking about some very controversial bodies like the BBC, and so the word bespoke is to take account of the fact that these are very different animals and require different treatment.
Fifth, excuse me, and lastly, there will need to be a review of the precise role of government in relation to ALBs, as in the status of a public corporation under the 1969 Act. There's no appetite at any level for politicians to be micromanaging organisations like the post office or hospitals, colleges or government laboratories, but an explicit mandate to deal with failing organisations, as with schools, NHS trusts and police forces, might be helpful. Can you explain what you mean by an explicit mandate?
Well, the question I'm addressing here is one that runs, I think, through the heart of this inquiry, which is this whole question of the distinction between operational questions and strategic questions, where you draw the line. And I think in general it is sensible policy that agencies of government should not be micromanaged from the centre, whether they're schools or public corporations. But that does require some mechanism to ensure that when they go very badly wrong, there is an opportunity for government, the minister sitting behind them, to interfere. And I think this has been thought through in the case of schools and hospitals. It's clear that in this case that there wasn't a kind of emergency mechanism where probably my successors would have been able to move in very quickly and take over the organisation, appoint new management, and start from scratch.
So in colloquial language, special measures type enterprise.
Yes.
So Vince, those are my questions. Thank you for answering them.
Thank you.
There'll be some questions from core participants. May I suggest we have our second break now until 12:10. There are about 45 minutes of questions, which will take us to the lunch break.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. 12:10.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So before the core participants ask their questions, there's one matter that I'd omitted to ask on behalf of a core participant, so I ought to do that first. It'll only take a couple of minutes.
Certainly.
Thank you, sir. Can we turn up paragraph 90 of your witness statement, please? It's on page 36. And about 5 lines from the bottom, you say it was clear that in my period in office, the operational failures were sufficiently widespread and serious as to justify government intervention. These were not identified or recognised within the government. The reason, so far as I can tell, was that officials in SHIEX were misinformed or lied to by their counterparts in the Post Office. And then similarly, page 41, at the foot of the page, paragraph 110, 2 lines from the bottom, it's clear that in my period in office, the operational failures were not identified or recognised as systemic or engaging strategy. The reason, so far as I can tell, was that officials in SHIEX were misinformed or lied to by their counterparts in the Post Office. Firstly, would you agree that there is a distinction between SHIEX misinforming on the one hand or lying to, on the other, their counterparts in the Post Office?
Yes, indeed. There is an important distinction, yes.
Are you able to assist the inquiry as to the basis for the assertion that any officials in SHIEX were lied to by their counterparts in the Post Office?
No, nothing specific. I've been trying to follow the inquiry at some distance, and that is the kind of language and interpretation that I've heard. And you've taken evidence from Ed Davey, who certainly felt very strongly that he had been very seriously misinformed or lied to. It wasn't clear which, and that matters might have been addressed if that information had been given to him.
Are you able to assist the inquiry from your own knowledge, rather than having watched the inquiry proceedings, as to the identity of any individual within SHIEX who was lied to by their counterparts?
No, I certainly can't do that. SHIEX were one of many departments within the BIS. As far as I was concerned, they were just part of the BIS civil service. We had, I think, 3,000 to 4,000 of civil servants. And I had no particular reason to reflect on who SHIEX were in this context, or who the individual civil servants were, or indeed their relationships with the Post Office.
Thank you very much. So those are the supplemental questions. I think it's Ms. Patrick first, then Ms. Page, and then Mr. Jacobs.
So Vince, good afternoon. My name's Angela Patrick, and I represent, together with Mr. Maloney Casey and Hudjo Solicitors, a number of sub-postmasters who were convicted and have since had their convictions quashed, including Mrs. Hamilton, who I'm sure you can see sitting to my right.
Yes.
And you're glad to hear I've got one issue I want to cover with you in questions, and it's looking back at your witness statement. And at paragraphs 117 to 118, you deal with your knowledge and experience on the backbenches before you came to government. And you've dealt with that a little with Mr. Beer this morning. I just want to look again at paragraph 118, if we could. And if that could be brought up for you, I'd be grateful. It's WITN 108 301 00, and it's page 44 at the top. And you can you see that, Sir Vince? It says, from 1999 to 2003, I was the Liberal Democrat Trade and Industry spokesman, and you make clear you've never been the Shadow Secretary of State, and you say you're extensively involved in issues related to post office closures, and you remembered Alan Johnson introducing Horizon as a system. You've dealt with that a little this morning with Mr. Beer. It's the second part I want to look at particularly, and if you see that there, when I was a backbencher, there were continuing debates about government IT systems. The NHS and Inland Revenue systems were complete disasters. So there was a certain amount of scepticism about this new IT system, Horizon, but we had no information indicating that this one didn't or wouldn't work. And I just want to ask you a few questions about that. So before you took up your ministerial role, you were aware of continuing debates about government IT systems being problematic. And those debates were about IT failures in multiple public IT projects. You're nodding, Sir Vince. For the transcripts, unfortunately, you have to either say yes or no.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear your question.
Sorry. You were aware, looking at your evidence, that there had been IT failures in multiple different public projects.
Yeah, the answer is yes. Yes.
And you give examples of the NHS and the Inland Revenue, but there had been others, hadn't there?
Yes, indeed.
And this had informed a public narrative that government and other public bodies, when it came to IT, came with a particular known susceptibility to a degree of risk. Is that fair?
I'm not sure this was necessarily just public bodies. I think probably private companies had the same problem.
Okay. But there had been disasters which had been particularly costly to the public purse, hadn't there?
Yes, there had. In fact, shortly before I went into government, I remember taking Gordon Brown to task because of the problems of the Inland Revenue and large amounts of loss of money.
Yeah. And there had been projects that were just, as you put it, simply complete disasters in the sense that they just simply didn't do what they were intended to do. Is that fair?
Yes, I think it is fair. Yeah.
And you refer there in your witness statement to a certain amount of scepticism about Horizon. Would you have expected that kind of scepticism that you held about public IT systems and Horizon itself to have been adopted by others, including in the post office, in the civil service, and in other public agencies contracting for IT or managing IT systems?
Yeah, I would have expected people to be inherently sceptical. I think in the case of the post office, I remember there was this flurry of concern when Alan Johnson was the minister, and quite a lot of questions were asked, including by me. But by the time I'd been in government, that was 10 years later, and that they'd had 10 years to get their system organised and iron out any problems. And so I had no reason to assume that it wasn't working properly.
But putting Horizon to one side just for a minute, you were aware of continuing reporting of problems in these kind of IT projects, including in the public sector, at the time you became Secretary of State?
Yes, that's fair. Yeah.
I mean, just to be really obvious, from 2010 on, the historic risk about IT, public or private, didn't go away with the forming of the coalition, did it?
No, I'm sure.
No. So if I can take just one example to see if I can spark your memory a little. If I mention Libra, a system that was running in the Magistrates' Court, and another system that had been developed by ICL Fujitsu, and it having been criticised in the mainstream media following work by the NAO in 2011, would that have been something you'd have been aware of?
Not that specific case, I don't think so.
And again, stepping away from Horizon for a second, if there were allegations and concerns about a third-party contractor who was contracting across government and different public IT platforms, were there systems in place for information sharing across government departments or public agencies where there were different commercial contracts with different departments or different public bodies?
I certainly knew nothing about that. I think the only, trying to help answer your question, that I think in the middle of my period of Secretary of State, the computer systems actually broke down in my department, and I tried to find out why that was, and it was being blamed on me because I had given instructions that contracts should be awarded to small companies rather than big multinationals where there was a choice. And it turned out that the small guys hadn't been able to operate the system properly. Fortunately, the decision had to be reversed. But so I was aware that there had been systems failures. Yeah.
I think we're at slight cross purposes, St Vince. I'm just asking if you can help the inquiry understand where you have different commercial contracts with a third-party contractor in different government departments or different public agencies. Is there a system across government for sharing intelligence about concerns that might arise in respect of one contractor, albeit that there are different contracts with different bodies or different public departments?
Well, the answer is I don't know, but I think that the Cabinet Office were the people in government whose job it was to ensure that that kind of coordination took place.
Okay. And I think you've told Mr Beer this morning that Horizon wasn't on your radar till fairly late in your ministerial appointment. Whether in 2013, at the time of the Private Eye article being circulated to you, or later in March 2015 when you were dealing with the correspondence around the Select Committee and James Arbuthnot, if you had been aware either of difficulties in the early development of Horizon, and separately, if there were other difficulties arising in projects developed or managed by ICL Fujitsu, would either of those matters have increased or decreased your scepticism?
As I explained to Mr Beer, I think the 2013 case I just saw as a public relations issue. I didn't realise it was anything to do with policy. Perhaps I should have read it more carefully, but I didn't realise at the time. And the 2015 case, yes, indeed, all of these issues came together, and I did realise there was a systemic problem here because a lot of serious people were questioning it. I don't remember the name of the contractor for Fujitsu ever been mentioned in this context, but as your question suggests, there was an issue with them.
And separately, if you had would you have expected if anyone in the post office or in SHIEX or in any role responsible for representing the interests of the shareholder, if they'd had information about difficulties in the early development of Horizon or difficulties arising in other projects run by the contractor, would you have expected them to have similarly increased scepticism?
Yes, I would, but I think your phrase about the early stages, I mean, I think it was introduced in 1999. So I think 10 years later, I would have expected that if there were any problems, they'd been dealt with.
Indeed, and the inquiry has held evidence about the development and the management of Horizon throughout the years, and I'm not asking you questions about that evidence. But one final question. Can you recall, we've talked about issues arising, can you recall whether there was any discussion about the performance of Fujitsu as a repeat government contractor across departmental lines at any time when you were Secretary of State?
No, I can't recall them. My dealings with Fujitsu in a totally different context, because we had an industrial strategy designed to develop manufacturing industry. And I think they were partners or part of the ICT arm of the industrial strategy, and they contributed to thinking about government training and so on. But I certainly was never involved, to my recollection, in any discussions about Fujitsu as a contractor.
And just to raise, having said that, and their role in the wider industrial strategy, we know that the campaign run by sub-postmasters, including Mrs Hamilton, was running well before you became Secretary of State in 2010. At any time when you were talking to civil servants or other officials around the strategy and any role played by Fujitsu, did anyone mention that they were involved in these concerns around horizon issues?
Not that I recall, no.
Would you have expected that ought to have been something that was raised with you?
Well, as I said, and in response to Mr. Beer's question, I did expect to have been briefed at the beginning of my term of office that questions were being raised about the computer system by serious people, which they were, but I was not briefed about it, no.
Thank you very much, Sir Vince. Those are all the questions that we have.
Thank you.
Over to me now, I think, Sir Vince. I'd like to ask you about your strategic objectives.
Yes.
No need to bring it up, but in paragraph 31 of your witness statement, you set out 3 strategic objectives. The first was to secure funding for the network, and network transformation specifically, with a view to stopping closures, yes?
Yes.
And then your second was to separate the Post Office from Royal Mail Group, with a view to then privatising Royal Mail Group.
Correct.
And then finally, you hoped to mutualise the Post Office.
Correct.
How did you come up with those 3 strategic objectives?
Well, it was I was responsible for the department. I'd had a background in post office issues to a limited extent. I think the overriding one of those 3 was the getting funding for network transformation. It was difficult because this was a time of austerity. Most government services were being cut. I could see from my having dealt with the post office network that it was in a state of collapse. It had fallen from, I think, 17,000 to 11,000 branches in the decade since I first raised it. And unless something dramatic was done, there wasn't going to be a network, although it mattered enormously to millions of people. So it needed an injection of cash and commitment to turn it round. And certainly whenever I met post office officials, I didn't very often, but when I did, the issue was at the top of my mind was, were they doing this effectively? Was it working? And it was actually, because I think, to my recollection, there haven't been any more post office closures net since that time.
So that objective was your preeminent one. Your second strategic objective, was that interlinked to it?
I don't think they were necessarily linked. The issues around the separation of the post office and the Royal Mail were essentially sort of technical and legal, and I think they were handled very effectively by Ed Davey, who did a lot of the preparations for that and the legislation around it. I didn't get involved in that. The third one, which I did care about, goes back to when I was campaigning for the postmasters. We felt as a matter of principle that this was a very unequal and unfair relationship. It needed to be addressed, and it needed radical change, and we had support for that idea from the Federation. So that was how that originated. It was quite disconnected from the others.
Well, the second one, of course, was pre-existing in the sense that the previous Labour administration had made moves in the direction of separation and privatisation. That's
yes.
right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
And obviously your first objective of securing the 2 billion funding for the network, that did happen, and there was then a period of time over which that funding was released. Your second objective was also a success, though, wasn't it, in at least this sense, that when all shares were sold in Royal Mail Group, that brought in 3.3 billion for the Treasury, didn't it?
Yes, there was a big dispute as to whether we could have got more, but in retrospect, actually the Royal Mail is worth less now than when we sold it. So yes, I think that was considered a success. I mean, the issue was not actually simply a question of raising money. The main reason we did it was to enable the Royal Mail to survive. Its business was dying because people...
To bring in private injections.
Yes, the Treasury would not allow the Post Office to raise, would not allow it to borrow when it was under public ownership. So if it was to finance its, to modernise, it could only happen in the private sector.
But I asked you whether the two were interlinked, and you have suggested not. Are you saying that George Osborne's Treasury would have given out 2 billion for the network if there hadn't have been the promise of 3.3 billion coming in from the sale of...
No, I think they were completely separate issues. We had no idea at the time that the sale was launched how much would be realised, and there was no connection.
Even though, as you said yourself, this was a time of cutting back, a time of the launch of austerity, and the Treasury was very reluctant to give out money.
Yes, no, actually, the big cost of the Treasury was the cost of the pension fund. It swamped all the other financial consideration.
Well, that's certainly another factor, isn't it?
But
because
if I
there
could,
was some
just finish my answer, the reason we pressed for it was for political reasons. It was certainly I believed, and my party colleague believed, that the post office network was a major national priority and it needed funding. And we, in the negotiations with the Treasury, identified certain key issues, and that was one, and Catapult Network was another. I could list half a dozen where we wanted more money, even at a time when cuts were having to be made.
But you couldn't sell Royal Mail Group with the problems that it had with the pension pot, could you? There was a £28 billion pension pot there that needed to cover 37.5 billion of liabilities, didn't it?
Yes, no, it had to be dealt with before a sale could take place. No shareholders would have taken it on otherwise.
And although that was a problem in the sense that the liabilities were greater than the sum of money there, in the short term for the Treasury, that was 28 billion straight in the door, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed.
Albeit that there was then, for future administrations, a long-term problem of 37.5 billion that needs to be paid out in the future.
Yes, well, as you know, there has been a big argument about the measurement of the liabilities of pension funds depending on the interest rate and the discount rate. So, I mean, we could have a long debate about the privatisation of Royal Mail, but I'm trying to see the connection.
Well, the simple point is this. Those issues were interrelated, weren't they? There was no way there was going to be funding for the Post Office unless the Treasury was going to get in both the 28 billion pension pot and what was ultimately, although not known at the time, 3.3 billion in shares.
I didn't see them as interlinked. I saw them as separate problems. How
did the people within Post Office and Royal Mail Group know about your 3 strategic objectives?
Almost certainly because I told them. I had a courtesy meeting with the chief executive and the chair shortly after the post office was separated, and I spelt out what I wanted them to do. And the post ministers were aware that those were our priorities and very aware of them and carried them out.
Can I just then turn to some of the specifics about how they may have related to what happened within Post Office? In July of 2013, you were making an announcement in Parliament about privatisation. And shortly before that, Jo Swinson had to give a short reaction in Parliament to the Second Sight interim report. What I'd like to be brought up, first of all, is her statement. It's poll 2014-1558. And if we just zoom in to the middle of the second paragraph, there's just a one-liner and it says this. It is important to note that this is the second paragraph as we see it on the page. It's important to note that the issues in the report, that's the Second Sight interim report, have no impact on Royal Mail, which is an entirely separate business. If we also go to a whips briefing that lies behind that statement from Ms Swinson, if we could go please to UKGI 401679. And we go to page 2, please, and under a heading of wider impacts. And as I say, this is the whips briefing that sits behind the statement that Jo Swinson made on the 9th of July. The timing of Arbuthnot's intended statement, that's his intended statement about the Second Sight interim report, should be considered in the context of the Royal Mail privatisation. Vince Cable and Michael Fallon are making a statement to Parliament on Wednesday, the 10th of July, so that's just one day after Ms Swinson's statement, setting out the steps towards a Royal Mail transaction. In the eyes of many MPs, the media and the public at large, Royal Mail and the Post Office are the same entity. Although not related, the adverse coverage that Arbuthnot is seeking to attract is likely to have a significant and diversionary impact on the messaging of the Royal Mail statement. So those can come down. So here's the point, isn't it, Sir Vince, that it was seen as essential not to let problems with the Second Sight interim report get in the way of a statement that you were about to make that related to privatisation.
Well, that's your assertion, but I don't think that's correct, actually. I mean, I became involved in the Royal Mail privatisation because it was highly controversial, and I had to lead from the front. I mean, it was being led by a Minister of State. But I got sufficiently involved to be aware of some of the risk factors. I don't recall this ever being mentioned. The big risk factor was around the trade union, the CWU, who were threatening to go on strike. That was a big risk factor for the investors. And that was the only one that I recall being discussed with any seriousness.
So this going on in the background, we can take it that it wasn't something that was coming directly from you, but nevertheless, this was because you had communicated your 3 strategic objectives, something which people knew you needed to have happen, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So whilst you may not have become involved in what people at Post Office and indeed in government supporting Ms Swinson were getting up to, they were helping because they thought it was necessary to get the privatisation over the line.
Yes, well, getting the privatisation over the line depended on managing a group of risk factors. I don't recall this being one of them. As I say, the risk factors overwhelmingly centred on industrial relations issues. It may be, as you say, that there were people who were involved in the Post Office who were worried that they might be creating a problem. But the people who would identify risk factors were the brokers and the investment managers, and they would have said, you know, this is worrying us. I don't recall they ever did.
Well, you may not have seen some of the evidence in the inquiry about Ms Venables' work on the prospectus.
Okay.
And she, in fact, managed to get a section in the prospectus taken out that was going to be about the Horizon problems. So, and she told her chair, Miss Perkins, that she had earned her keep on that one. So that may have been an example, mayn't it, Sir Vince, where you didn't know, but the people who were acting within the post office knew that there was a risk factor that they wanted to take out of the picture in order to help your strategic direction?
Yes, what you say seems to be perfectly fair. All I can say is that I wasn't aware of it as a risk factor. And I was involved in the privatisation, so I would have, I think, known.
Yes. Well, let me just give you another example, perhaps, of what may have been going on behind the scenes. If I could bring up poll 2029 6944, please. This is an email between the Chief Executive and the Chair, and it's about finessing the Second Sight interim report. And in that second paragraph, she's referring to conversations that she had with her General Counsel, Susan Crichton. She says, I caught up with Susan this evening after we finished. She had finished her meeting with Second Sight, and she says, Wade, but I think we can take it, she was of the view that they do now understand the risk of being caught up in something bigger and more sensitive. She is hoping their report should be more balanced, should say they have found no evidence of systemic Horizon computer issues, but will confirm shortcomings in support processes and systems, and that Post Office has already identified and corrected a number of these. And then she talks about James Arbuthnot. I hope when they speak to James tomorrow, they will confirm all this. They will also want to say their work is not finished and therefore still not conclusive. Now, something bigger and more sensitive. This email is on the 1st of July of 2013. Ms. Swinson was to make the statement about the interim report in Parliament on the 9th of July, and your statement about privatisation was on the 10th of July. This, again, rather looks as if this is people within the Post Office worrying about the Second Sight tying into something bigger and more sensitive, i.e. the privatisation. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does make sense.
Yeah. So this appears to be an attempt to have the interim report's findings managed in a way so as not to disrupt your strategic plans. Are you confident that there was no one in government putting any pressure on Post Office to do that sort of thing?
Well, I simply don't know. The Czechs, who were the unit responsible for the Post Office, were also the people who were managing the privatisation from the BIS point of view, so it was the same group of people. Whether they acted the way you described, I have absolutely no way of knowing, but I can see that if you're looking for, no, conspiracy is too hard a word, but if you're looking for attempts to manage the issue, then what you say makes sense.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Sir Vince, my name is Sam Steen. I appear on behalf of a very large group of sub-postmasters and staff that worked in branches. I work with Mr. Jacobs, who appears on my left, and we're instructed by a firm of solicitors who've long been a thorn in the side of the Post Office called Howe & Co. Now, you've been asked a number of questions by Mr. Beer about the correspondence that either was or wasn't sent through to your office when you were Secretary of State for BIS, and what happened to that. And I'm just going to quote from paragraph 37 of your statement. We don't need it on the screen. So, Vince, you say there this: whilst Horizon was on a few occasions raised in correspondence addressed to me, with very few exceptions, my correspondence were dealt with by officials at the level of the responsible junior minister, none of whom flagged these issues to me as needing my engagement. That's what you said in your statement. You've been asked a large number of questions about that by Mr. Beer. okay? I'm not going to repeat those questions. I'm going to go to a different type of information that BIS was aware of. Can we go, please, to a document which is POL 00141382. Right, now the date of this document is May of 2012. If you'll take that from me, I'll be very grateful. Helpfully for me, you started as Secretary of State for BIS in May of 2010. So this is pretty much 2 years into your time as Secretary of State dealing with these matters. And you've just been asked a few questions that touched upon post office network transformation. You're familiar with the discussions about that. And you'll recall, I hope, that there was a BIS select committee that was set up to consider issues that related to network transformation at around the same time in 2012.
No, I don't actually recall that, but I appeared before the Select Committee every year, and they interrogated me about the things that they thought I should know.
Right. Now, this is the written evidence, as you'll see, submitted by Shoesmith solicitors. And you can see there that if we go to just a few of these paragraphs, paragraph 2, Access Legal from Shoesmiths, a national law firm, have been contacted by almost 100 SPMs, sub-postmasters, who have suffered losses they cannot explain and have been subject to disciplinary measures by POL. All are adamant that they or their staff have not stolen any money. They claim that the Horizon system, and in brackets, an electronic point of sale and accounting system that POL require them to use, has caused the errors or not enabled them to work out why the errors have appeared in the first place. They go on to say there, they claim that there has been no real investigation by POL as to the cause of the losses that have appeared. SPMs are expected to pay it back regardless of how it was caused. Go to paragraph 3. POL are adamant that the Horizon system has no faults. And go down to paragraph 7, please. What is being said here is about if the SPM is ever faced with a loss when balancing, the SPM is presented with 2 options on the Horizon system, settle centrally or make good loss. Settle centrally means that, according to POL, the loss can be investigated. However, the description of this from SPMs is that it just means the loss will be taken from the SPM's remuneration, either as a lump payment or in stages. If make good loss is selected, the SPM must make good the loss there and then out of their own pocket. If you just continue down, please. One of these options must be selected, otherwise an SPM will not be able to trade the following day. And I'm just going to then touch on paragraph, I think it's 8. Yeah. Some of the SPMs have told Horizon that they've made good the losses when in actual fact they haven't. The reasons they do this vary, but are typically related to an inability to pay, often due to have made various repayments previously, and a desire to keep the post office open for their community. When doing the above, an SPM is committing false accounting, albeit not to enrich themselves or to deny POL what is rightfully theirs. So by the time we get to paragraph 8, we've got a description of, by a national law firm representing 100 sub-postmasters in May of 2012, setting out real fundamental difficulties with the Horizon system, people being made to do things within their branches that they shouldn't have to. So these are complicated, cogent submissions being made by this law firm, Shoesmith. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
Now, did this information, this submission, get through to you?
No.
Right. Help the rest of us understand why not. This is a public consultation by a select committee in Parliament where these issues, which are serious, are being raised in relation to network transformation, which is meant to be transformative of the post office. Get this thing up and running, put it back on its feet. But the Shoesmith solicitors are saying, hang on, there's a real problem here. How come that didn't get through to you as the Secretary of State for Biz?
I don't know why it didn't get through to me. My own perceptions, as I tried to describe earlier, were based on the contacts I had with individual postmasters. And I was aware, as I've described, that there were some terrible things happening. And the one that I cared most about was in my own constituency. And I'd contacted the family and I said, you know, what's happened? We've lost our post office. You're being charged with fraud. What happened? And the explanation from the family was, I didn't speak directly to the postmaster, was we think that we made a mistake and we've been punished in a ridiculously excessive way. So that's how I started thinking about this problem. And as I also said, I think round about 2012-13, I was visited by the Federation, a regional head or a national figure, I don't know, but I was visited by the Federation who had this scrapbook full of photographs of some of these postmasters who were in terrible situations. I mean, you know all about them, they've been in the inquiry. And clearly very emotional about it. And we sat in a meeting trying to understand why this had happened. And the theory they had, and I agreed with, was that what was happening was that mistakes were being made, you know, obvious mistakes, but, you know, postmasters are handling vast sums of money and large numbers of transactions, people, you know, perfectly honest, understandable mistakes we all make in every aspect of life. And they were being brutally punished for it. And that was my understanding. It was this kind of one strike and you're out policy, which the way I interpreted it. And the Federation, when they came to see me, confirmed that view. I don't ever recall this being discussed in terms of horizon problems. I mean, it may have been mentioned, but it didn't register with me because other people were giving a very clear explanation about why this was happening. It was reflected very badly on the post office, but it wasn't about computers.
Well, let's have a look at what is being said in a very clear explanation a little bit further. Paragraph 8, description there of what is happening by SPMs that are having to make good the losses when they haven't, and related to an inability to pay, desire to keep the post office open for their community. And when doing that, the Shoesmith submissions say this: when doing the above, an SPM is committing false accounting, albeit not to enrich themselves or deny a poll what is rightfully theirs. Paragraph 9, last sentence, losses that are being discussed by Shoesmith solicitors, losses between 6,000 and 150,000. Paragraph 10, the SPN then has, according to Poll, an opportunity to explain the losses and so on. Typically, the SPM's contract will be terminated and Poll will request that any losses are repaid under the contract. Paragraph 12 we'll touch on, and I'll move on to something that may assist in relation to the NFSP. If the loss is not repaid, Poll will prosecute the SPM for false accounting. SPMs are typically advised by the legal advisors to plead guilty to false accounting. As in the above circumstances, they have committed it. Many will be charged with theft or fraud, but these charges are typically dropped in these circumstances. SPMs have been imprisoned as a result of convictions for false accounting. So Vince, my point on behalf of the group of people I represent, the sub-postmasters, people working in branches, is that these were all matters that could have been investigated, that could have been looked into by BIS, essentially the department in control over the post office. But this was never taken to your level. Is that right?
That's correct.
Well, let's deal with the NFSP. Paragraph 17. National Federation of Sub-Postmasters, the NFSP, are the trade association for SPMs. They negotiate with Poll on behalf of SPMs and provide representation at disciplinary meetings. They state publicly that there are no issues with Horizon. Many SPMs report that they receive no useful assistance from the NFSP when they have accounting difficulties. And it goes on to refer to the Communications Workers Union, the CWU. The relevant union for Poll employees has recently set up a branch to assist and represent SPMs. So there, the government, BIS, is being told that there's a problem with the NFSP. And if that had been looked into, it would have discovered that the NFSP was being paid off by the Post Office. So all of these issues were being set out lucidly, cogently, in simple submissions that 14 years later we've been examining through the Post Office inquiry. All of these points now we know to be true. But BIS did what, as far as you know, with these submissions?
I have no idea what they did with them. On this particular point about the Federation, I think I've explained in answers to Mr. Beer, my dealings with them were very limited but positive. I first brought to Parliament the case of a postmistress who had lost her post office, lost upwards of £100,000, and I asked for help from the Federation to advise me, and they succeeded in getting full compensation. So why would I not think of this as an effective trade union? And similarly, in the other cases that were brought to me, which I've already described, it was clear that they cared passionately about the hardship that postmasters were experiencing. I had no reason whatever to doubt their integrity or their competence.
Let's move on through the chronology. This is 2012, 2 years into your time, Secretary of State for BIS, okay? Now, you've said this in your evidence, that by the time we get to 2015, you'd realised something bad was happening. And you say, and you've said to this inquiry, that what happened at that stage was that was the end of your term as Secretary of State. And you wish, essentially, that you'd been able to stay on so that you could do something about this. So your words were, you realised something bad was happening. Well, you're right. Jacqueline Falcon was prosecuted in 2015 by the CPS for fraud. She was prosecuted for her work at the Hadston Post Office. She'd worked there for eight and a half years. In total, she'd worked in branches for 15 years from the year 2000, Hadston branch for 8.5 years, and losses below £1,000. A shortfall was discovered in that particular branch. The end of 2014, that was discovered. In 2015, early 2015, she, by that point, based upon advice, pleaded guilty to fraud into a suspended sentence for 3 months. In 2015, Jacqueline Falcon was pregnant. Going through all of that, so she was prescribed antidepressants. So you're right, Sir Vince. Something bad was happening. Now, when we try and understand what happened at that point, when you hand over to the next person to take on the job of ignoring the problems with the Post Office, at that particular point, what did you do to say to the next person, hang on, there's a real problem here, something bad is happening?
Well, the answer is I was unemployed after the election for 2 years until I got my job back. But it appears to be the case, and I was frankly shocked by this, nothing to do with the Post Office, but that when a new government comes in, they start with a completely blank sheet of paper. I was never, when I became Secretary of State, the civil service would not tell me what my predecessors had been advised on a whole range of issues. It was thought to be improper, that we start again with a new parliament, we have to reinvent the wheel. That unfortunately is the way government operates. But certainly if I'd met Sajid Javid, who was my successor, and this issue had come up, I would have certainly passed on that advice. But the way government works, there isn't a transition, there is no carryover. It's entirely reliant on the civil service to maintain continuity.
So, Vince, we understand that happens certainly between transition of one government from one party to another. So recently, as we understand it, the position is that the Labour government will not have access to Conservative government papers. Does that also happen, to your knowledge, in relation to the next administration, even though it may be the same individuals involved?
Well, it wasn't the same individual.
No, it could be, though.
It could be.
Yes. Does that happen in the same way?
I don't know, but
Right.
It's common sense suggests that it should.
Didn't we have evidence from the Conservative minister who succeeded the Conservative minister. I forget the precise dates. That's exactly what happened.
Yes, well, I think we're establishing that, sir. My
Yeah,
question is whether it relates to this.
Miss James said she didn't have a briefing from Baroness Neville Rolfe.
Yes, but my question related to whether, even if it's the same minister, whether essentially that they're not allowed background their own papers if they carry on.
Sorry, that's a variation on it. Sorry,
Yes.
Mrs.
Now, so we're going through time. As you say, you spent 2 years outside of Parliament, then you come back into Parliament, yes?
Yes.
Right, so the timing that we're now getting to, 2017, 2018, you're aware that by that point that there are then, in 2019, the judgments in the High Court.
No, I wasn't aware. No.
Well, when were you first aware of the judgments by Mr. Justice Fraser, now Lord Justice Fraser, in the High Court?
Well, I wasn't aware, I think, till this whole inquiry process started, and the journalists started asking me about it and what I knew, and following the evidence. I certainly I'd lost all contact with this issue after 2015.
Okay. So when you came back into Parliament, and we know that there were issues that were in relation to the Post Office going through the High Court, you're saying you were aware of that later, and you know that there are issues being raised in relation to the criminal appeals. Did you look into any aspect of those matters?
No, I would have looked into aspects of those matters if any of my constituents had become involved. I'd reverted to being a backbencher. I happened to be leader of the party, but that was a separate matter. But in relation to parliamentary business, I would only have encountered them if postmasters in Twickenham had been in this situation. I don't think there were any.
You see, that represented an opportunity for you to do what you've criticised other MPs for. So if you had engaged with these issues, if you had read the judgments from the High Court, had paid attention to what was going on, you would have been able to say to the government at that time, in 2019, hang on, there's been a problem here. When I was looking at matters such as this, nobody brought this to my attention.
Well, had I known about it, I could possibly have intervened in the way you described. But when I came back into Parliament in 2017, government and opposition were completely overwhelmed by the big new issue, which is called Brexit. And as the leader of my party at the time, I was having to devote 100% of my time to focusing on that, apart from the time I spent on constituency issues. And I raised issues for constituents in Parliament, in debate and questions. I didn't range outside that. But there were many outstanding issues. One of the things which followed me was this Saudi arms deal, for example. And there were half a dozen issues like that I dealt with in Parliament, and I realised were still hanging around 2 years later, and I was being asked about them. But for the reasons I've given, I wasn't then in the business of dealing with post office issues.
Last question. Let's turn it around the other way. Did anyone in government go to you and say, Sir Vince, we've got these issues at the High Court. You may or may not know about them, but let me tell you about them. They've raised serious, deep-rooted problems within the Post Office about the Horizon system. It's a mess. Total debacle. People being sent to prison under horrendous circumstances, lives being ruined. Did anybody come to you and say, Sir Vince, what were you told about this during your time at BIS?
Nobody came to me and asked that question. I wish they had,
Yes.
but
Thank you,
they
Sir
didn't.
Vince.
Thanks, Mr. Steen. Is that it, Mr. Beer?
Yes, it is, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Vince, for making your witness statement and for coming to the inquiry this morning and answering questions from a number of people. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you very much, Sir Wynne.
So could we reconvene at 2 p.m., please?
Yes.
Thank you very much.